of the network was visiting Jamaica from the embassy of Sierra Leone. I hope you and I have been there. There's no problem. He wanted to observe this session.
We're not a secret sect, you know, not
I know,
some have labeled us externally. We actually, you know, there is a proper place for quiet deliberation, but that does not equate to secretiveness or secrecy. Welcome, over to you.
Thank you so much, Minister Nalo, for your report. And I want to thank the entire committee and the staff that are supporting outstanding, important work being done by this committee on behalf of the nation. I'm going to start there. And I want to also thank you for the opportunity to have us present our perspectives of what we see as important in creating a new constitution for Jamaica. And we want to share some comments about the terms of reference of the CRC and your own work. Now, the Advocates Network is a non-partisan alliance of individuals and organizations advocating for human rights and good governance to improve Jamaica's social and economic conditions. And we want ultimately to transform lives. We've been encouraging active citizen participation in addressing the range of social and economic problems we face in Jamaica: inequality, justice, discrimination, etc. We see these issues as part of the legacy of slavery and colonization that have persisted over time and contribute to the human rights abuses and poor governance that we see in Jamaica. And so therefore we join this constitutional reform discussion through historical lens. And the lens is shaped by our history, by the journey of our ancestors since the arrival of Columbus in 1494. We are guided by the social, economic, and political objectives rooted in the dreams and aspirations of a resilient people in their search for freedom, self-determination, and a true recognition of their humanity. So, constitutional changes to create a republic provides a second opportunity. Since 1962, for Jamaicans to create the legal foundations to achieve these objectives. At independence, our leaders chose to keep the British monarchy and transfer real power in the hands of the cabinet. And according to section 69, subsection 2, as the principal instrument of policy with the general direction and control of government under the leadership of the Prime Minister. And in so doing, our leaders centralized power in the hands of the Prime Minister without effective arrangements for accountability and participatory governance. So today, our current constitutional monarchy is effectively a consolidation of executive power. We refer to it as executive sovereignty instead of people sovereignty. We're guided by the democratic principle that Thomas Paine in his work, Rights of Man, made very clear. A constitution is not an act of government, but a people constituting a government. And we see this as requiring active engagement, not only in creating and shaping the constitution, but importantly, active engagement in governance, in ensuring that the laws are implemented the way they ought to. So it is our view that this move to a republic can't simply be about moving the king, the monarch, as head of state, but making a Jamaican, creating a state in which Jamaican people are sovereign, so that ultimately the authority lies with the people, encouraged to and empowered in their continuous pursuit for freedom self-determination, and the recognition of their humanity. It is this concept of the republic that we think is central to the democratic idea that the ultimate political authority should be derived from the will of the people, rather than the dictates of those with executive power. And so we're happy that we're finally on this road to Jamaicanizing our constitution. And we fully agree with the CRC in its terms of reference, where you make it very clear that what is required is the most meaningful and comprehensive post-independence constitutional reform work to be ever undertaken in Jamaica. This submission will focus on what we see as necessary changes to achieve this meaningful, comprehensive constitutional reform, and specifically to deepen our democracy, transform governance, and importantly, to improve the well-being of the Jamaican people. I think too often this conversation is divorced from our economic reality and the need to lift the standard of living of the Jamaican people. And so we also propose changes that we see as important in achieving these outcomes, and that's not an exhaustive list. And as I said earlier, we want to make some comments finally around the TOR. So let's start with the goals of the CRC. And there are three things that are embedded in that goal. One, to ultimately produce a new constitution in Jamaica, enacted by the Parliament of Jamaica. Secondly, to establish the Republic of Jamaica as a parliamentary republic to replace the constitutional monarchy. And lastly, to affirm Jamaica's self-determination and cultural heritage. So there's general agreement with that. The clarity of what a parliamentary republic means is not clear to many, not just at its network, but to many Jamaicans. And so we urge some definition that can help with the clarification. And, we've pointed to three things that we think are important in this concept. One is the sovereignty point that was made, the authority of the state belonging to the people and not a monarch or elite or the executive for that matter. The head of state, secondly, the head of state is not a hereditary monarchy or monarch, but separate from the head of government. And thirdly, a prime minister who is accountable to the House of Representatives and can be removed by a vote of no confidence. And that's there in our Constitution in section 71. Now, we want to highlight the fact that there are flaws, and there are many. And so we see the changes that ultimately must address these flaws and get us to another level. Our core objective is ultimately the rule of law. And we want to create a system in which the laws are made by our representatives, not ruling elites, so that our representatives make and implement law on our behalf. And so equality before the law and so on is important. What we've seen is for nearly 61 years, we've had major adequate mechanisms to hear the voice of the people and the inadequate structure of Parliament. And so the changes go to a redesign of the structure of Parliament. Now, I want to just pause and just say a little about the conversation we're having in the country about a presidential republic versus a parliamentary one. And the discussions about the type of president, ceremonial versus executive, or the method of selecting the president, and election versus appointment. And there are mixed views out there. Some are not quite decided among our network. Some see the selected president or a prime minister without a president, or a president with a prime minister. The presidency is seen as kind of a drain on national resources. We need it. And some refer to it as a substitute king representative. So those are some of the views out there. Others, and the way we framed the submission, is that an appointed president established to undertake well-defined, very specific roles that we clarify in the Constitution, that we're within a system, within a parliamentary framework to which we're accustomed, is preferable to shifting to a new, unfamiliar presidential system. It's a one. We're very concerned about the authoritarian culture we have in Jamaica. And we've seen it, and many studies have shown that today there is much more support of a strong man leadership in the country than a democratic leadership. And troubling data has revealed that. And so we're concerned about that in the context of a presidential arrangement that essentially could consolidate and strengthen the constitutional dictatorship. And so the concern lies there about an executive president elected by the people with a national mandate and likely to use that mandate to undermine oversight capacity of the legislature. And we observe in other countries that independence is often linked to a very solid economic foundation of the legislators. And in a society where we still have a very weak, dependent economy that can certainly subvert our fragile democracy. So there are some concerns, there are lessons to be learned from other republics. The Sri Lanka experience is an important one. We say, however, that while the type of president and the method of selection is important, we are of the view that addressing the flaws in our current system of governance is important. Whether we keep the parliamentary system or we shift to a new presidential system. And so we are very clear about that and what we see as necessary to restructure the inherited parliamentary arrangement is as follows. We spent some time on the matter of the first part of the Constitution, the preamble, or the very first chapter, because it's really necessary to highlight the historical, as well as the current ideals and aspirations of the Jamaican people. The fundamental, foundational statements of principles must be there. We took note of the perspectives of Professor Ed Ball in 1995 in his submission to this, where he included the source of the guiding principle as derived from the knowledge that they, out of a history of endurance, struggle, and sacrifice, which began in bondage and the exploitation of the majority of our ancestors. We see that that's an important statement as we seek to search and pursue these ideals of freedom, self-determination, and humanity. Right? The Americans they start their preamble with the people. And oftentimes we forget what follows in order to perfect a union. Perhaps we could say something like, we the people, in order to achieve the dreams of freedom, self-determination, and the pursuit of humanity, rooted in a history of resistance, endurance, struggle, sacrifice. Those are the kinds of preamble that I think is important, that would locate this document in our history. The preamble provides an opportunity to assert people's sovereignty, clearly stating that the power and authority of government is derived from the people of Jamaica. and affirming the ultimate authority of governments. That's important because we know that Jamaicans don't see ourselves as owners of this country. We think it's somebody else. And it's something I've observed talking to Jamaicans up and down this country. This country really is not ours. We may say yes because we think that's the right answer, but we don't feel it. So it needs to be asserted in the Constitution. And, talking about, we've said a lot about, the importance of education and so on. Just getting Jamaicans involved in creating that preamble, having a competition and getting young people talking about, what are your dreams and aspirations for the future? It's their future. We're creating a document for the young people of this country. Get them involved and let's find creative means to have them shape this preamble. The other thought was, if we have a preamble, we certainly want that supremacy clause in the Constitution, clearly stating that it's the supreme law, and to assert that the primacy of the Constitution is the law of the land. And, we could also make the point that the Constitution derives its authority from the people of the Republic, and bringing these two ideas together. So that's one important point about the supremacy clause, as well as the sovereignty clause. Again, a clear statement about whether the legitimacy of the people, the idea of people constituting government, becomes important, and make explicit at the source of power and authority, within which government acts. I think that clarity then shifts the frame for people, because we know it's there, it's in our Constitution. We can say, just as the Americans say, we the people, in order to continue this dream of freedom, self-determination, and the recognition that we're human beings. These issues are still challenging today. We see them in the extent to which we persist discrimination of forms. Now, in restructuring Parliament, we thought it was important to make clear the kind of role and responsibility of parliamentarians. And recently, when we heard about the sittings and so on, the utterances of the parliamentarians suggest that there's not a clarity about the primary role of parliamentarians in the lawmaking process, the legislative function, as well as the executive function, but importantly the oversight function of the executive by legislators, especially those that are not wearing the executive hat. And importantly, organizing public petitioning so that the voice of the Jamaican people can be part of the lawmaking process as a right. And so, to achieve that, we know that we have to look again at the size of the executive, make it smaller than the non-executive members of the legislature. The Constitution now speaks about executive members no less than 11. We suggest it could be no more than 16. And if we look at the smallest numbers of cabinet ministers over the last 10 years, it's about 16. Not fixed in stone, but that's the idea. And to provide better oversight of executive functions and accountability and so on. The oversight committees ought to be in the Constitution. The role of these committees as playing the central function as oversight. And, the suggestion there of, the issues that parliamentarians should consider, the monitoring, evaluation, the investigation, hearings, and so on. All of that becomes part of the legislative function. In the Senate, the idea is that we can elect our senators again, to play an important role in the legislative process, to provide oversight of the executive, to ensure the protection of minority rights, to organize these petitioning so opportunities have the voice of the people heard directly in the deliberations of the Parliament and in appointments, discipline, removal of senior officials, etc. And then, of course, we have a head of state that's appointed to undertake some clearly defined roles. The vesting role is important, vest executive power of Parliament, to assent to legislation, with provisions to scrutinize, veto position provisions or none, again, and of course, appropriate overrides if necessary, as we see fit. Those kinds of discussions about not just simply rubber stamping, but, scrutinizing and so on. Appointing key government officials, so we have already the arrangements in place with respect to members of the Service Commission, and then to carry out specific functions. And this is here's where I think Jamaican people really need to get creative, because, especially those who are concerned about the fact that we're spending all of this money for president. Perhaps there are some important issues that we want our president to do. For example, to strengthen our participation in the democracy. Making sure that, the right to petition is fully exercised, ensuring the rules are in place, whatever we think is important to give us a voice. We talk a lot in Jamaica about emancipating ourselves from mental slavery. Maybe that's a role we can give our president to help us in that task. But we can be creative. We think, national unity is important, building civil pride, morality, all those issues. We can be very specific and put them in the Constitution. So that's the idea, and that the nomination could come from the House, not necessarily the Prime Minister. The confirmation, the appointment done by 2/3 of the majority of the House, and so on. Now, the idea of the petitioning and the right to petition is important, and we elaborated that a bit. We currently have no such right. In fact, on the website of the government, there's a right to petition as a policy. And it states, as a citizen, you have the right to petition your government. The power lies within you to be an advocate for good governance and a agent of change. And that's how we see ourselves, right, as advocate network. But this right is enforceable in law. And so we think that teeth and meaning to that. And it's important for consensus building in our country, helping to build coalitions, mobilize support, get us to a common place as we come together to shape a petition on a particular issue. And it enhances our responsiveness to the needs, the Parliament's responsiveness to our needs and aspirations as Jamaicans, and ensure transparency, accountability, and so on. Now, the role of the judiciary is important, and the key role to interpret.
Just before you go to the judiciary, they proposed the right to petition. How do you see it operating? As really trying not to interrupt.
No problem. There would have to be rules that guide, for example, the number of, and there are many models across the world in terms of signatures that is required to get the petitions going, or a certain number of persons that, would have to submit the petitions and the document. And whatever one needs to be said will be submitted. Not unlike
the signing order is now a no
as an option.
Right. I was waiting, thank you, Dr. Barnett. I was waiting to also point out that in respect of the oversight committees, the committees are set out in the standing orders, and the standing orders are actually regulations of the Constitution provided for at section 51, subsection 1.
Right.
So it's not far removed
exactly
from the Constitution. In fact, it flows directly from it.
Absolutely, and it's the oversight role that we're not seeing. So in fact, what is being observed is that we've changed the leadership of these committees, but the outcome is the same. So they're not functioning as effective oversight mechanisms that deliberates on issues and gets results and decisions that sanction people. I mean, the issue faced in the country now is that about 7% of GDP is what we lose in corruption. Over $100 billion. Those reports by the Auditor General and so on are there. He points in the direction in which we could search, but we're not seeing the scale of sanctions that are associated with some of those things. So that's the idea of ensuring that they actually function, and that petition is an option. So we have seen very little of that arrangement. It's not a right, it's not an entitlement, and therefore that's the...
I think what is palpably absent is a structured mechanism within the rules, the existing rules, for the many reports that are generated to be discussed. So instead of a mere laying them on the table of the House and in the Senate, the sittings of committees and even Parliament can be restructured to ensure that when important reports are done, they are discussed. Now, all of these reports are in the public domain because once tabled, they are posted, and they can also be accessed from the source, whether it's the Auditor General or the Integrity Commission, and then they also go to Parliament. So structurally, there is a mechanism. It's how that mechanism is honored, I think, is the bane of contention.
Absolutely, yes. So it's more than discussion. It's what being made to actual action. And those rules and those clarity about how you use it. You see, the idea that it's optional is important because obviously, if a critical voice from the society who has experiential information that counters what the executive says, for example, that can easily be ignored. And we've seen that time and time again.
Perhaps you can look on an optional provision in a different way, that you can't mandate a citizen to make a petition, but you can provide an avenue or an option to be exercised should the citizen so desire to exercise it. So creating an option for something to be done as opposed to making it mandatory does not necessarily take away from the strength of it. It's a recognition that if there is a need to allow a mechanism for a citizen to be heard, you create it, but you can't mandate a citizen. So if you were to say that citizens must petition.
No, that's not so much the point. The point is that if the rules are clear and you fulfill those rules, then you exercise your right.
Yeah, I don't think
and it's not an optional thing.
this was a proposal to make it mandatory. I think what is the problem is that there is no methodology for the treatment of the petition. In other words, if you send in a petition and I never hear anything, and there's no mechanism by which a particular type of petition goes to a particular committee.
Absolutely.
And the second thing is that in the political arrangement of Parliament, it's unlikely that this will be effective unless you have what Prime Minister Osborne established, that is chairmanship of those committees by the opposition members. And I don't know why when that was discontinued, we didn't say anything about it, but that is a very effective way of making sure that what comes from the public is there.
Okay, so that's the kind of giving these opportunities for citizens to be engaged, some teeth, and I would certainly like to also add the opportunities for citizens across Jamaica to be heard and not having to come to Kingston to get their voices heard. So that's part of that as well.
Professor Hammond, people's voices are heard all over the island.
We have this city ought to be somewhere else as well, right? So that
the seat of government is in the capital city, but it doesn't mean. But the committee has been going around. I understand the bigger point, but
so
I think
Parliament sits one place, but some of these hearings and discussions and so on could go to the people.
I'll say that whether adequate or not, robust discussions take place between elected representatives and their constituents in many places. It's just that not everything is publicized, and sometimes people feel that if they don't see it live, it's not happening. But believe me, robust conversations take place.
Okay, so with respect to improving our judiciary, again, it plays an important role in upholding the rule of law, and we understand the importance of having the pause with respect to just having replaced the role of the Prime Minister in making these appointments. And we've seen experiences in the past that suggest that perhaps if these appointments are made by an elected Senate, we wouldn't have those crossing of the lines. Now, the judiciary, the Constitution now provides that the chairman of the Public Services Commission should be in the Judicial Service Commission, and we're suggesting that the separation should be there as well. All right, so the Caribbean Court of Justice, there's a lot that is said about that, and we definitely think that we need to establish that relationship. The accession to the full jurisdiction of the CCJ must be central and integral to this. What is important is an emerging decolonizing jurisprudence that's evolving at the court, and I reference the work of Professor Leslie Thomas that has provided some insights on that. And I think as we try to transform our society in partnership with a reformed executive and the legislative branches of government, we'll get some better outcomes. Now, the matter of participatory budgeting, many would say, I'm sure, that it doesn't belong in the Constitution. But I've cited countries like Brazil and Peru and South Korea and Portugal that have such provisions. And I think it's an important provision to ground the idea that people in communities can make specific decisions about a portion of our budget to address their needs. And not only does this improve our democracy and the citizen involvement, but significantly the idea of the legitimacy of our government and trust in government, where we can trust that the people of Jamaica can make good decisions about how to spend a share of the budget in their interest to solve specific problems. And as I contemplate, like many in this country, the problems we face in crime, we can ask ourselves, could we get different outcomes if we put some of those budgetary decisions to solve this problem in the communities that are most plagued by this problem? And so we're suggesting that participatory budgeting arrangements be made in which the citizens of Jamaica can have a direct say on a portion of that budget. A controversial idea, but an important one, is that we already have $20 million in the hands of MPs for decision making. And although we know that those decisions ought to be made in dialogue with citizens, we understand that typically they are not. And so stepping away and saying to citizens, and it's done, there are many models online, communities compete around which decision is the best way to spend the money to solve the problem. The rules could be laid out, and we can trust that the Jamaican people can make their own decisions to solve these problems.
Just to say that currently the CDF arrangements include a mandatory constituency-wide consultation in respect of projects. So the operations of the CDF begins with that consultation that is held in conjunction with the implementing agencies. And then projects are written based on those consultations. There are some standard projects around welfare, education, and there is a process of approving the projects as against the consultations and the issues. So it's not entirely absent.
May I ask whether you have considered this proposal in relation to local government? Have you considered it in its connection with local government? Because it seems that's where it could be most effective and is missing. And in fact, Minister, I don't know that I've ever heard from my representative, whether that may be anything about budget or expenditure in my constituency.
Can I speak to your MP?
He's not my MP, but he's in my area. Julian Robinson's the only MP I know that does this scrupulous thing, and he has these meetings and reports regularly.
Yes, so there's that.
Other puzzles do it. Yeah. Just to, before you come back in, just to follow on the point made by Dr. Barnett. Where the Constitution was amended in 2015, and the amendments came into effect on the 30th of July. And the provision, there shall continue to be a democratic system of local government for Jamaica. The purposes of local government shall be to A, encourage and assist the effective participation of local communities in the affairs of local government. The local authorities give local authorities the ability to provide local public service and facilities and to carry out other related activities for the benefit of local communities and the wider public. The ability to perform such regulatory functions as may be conferred on the local authorities by law. Facilitate the management, improvement and development of the resources of local communities. And the Local Governance Act of 2015 is actually a little more detailed because it does empower the local authorities to make laws, important laws, in respect of the areas. I think a lot of the governance concerns that have been raised can be addressed if what is provided for is actually fleshed out and the powers are exercised. And this is not to say there isn't room for improvement, but I don't believe that since the amendments were made, the rest of the work required to effectuate what was done has been done.
That's the point I'm making. That's the very point I'm making.
I was merely underscoring that point.
You see, one of the things we have to recognize, and it is very important and general, is that constitutions cannot solve all the problems.
Right.
You need to implement the principles so that there are lots of mechanisms which exist but are not used. There are lots of scope for improvements which are not implemented. And I really believe that civil society in particular will ensure that these things are done.
To your point, Dr. Barnett, I've more than thought about it. Since that particular local government regulation, I have been in communities. I have engaged MPs in matching funding grand projects that I've had, I've said to MPs, let's sit with constituents, let's get them to come up with ways to solve. We're talking about these thorny issues of crime. And without the details, it was an option as to whether to commit those crimes. That's the issue. And so the option was not exercised. The point is that if it's a rule and a requirement that citizens decide, you can get different outcomes. And that's why I said, yes, it can be ordinary legislation, but if we escalate it there in light of our experiences, then I think that we may get different outcomes. So as long as it's optional in the hands of the executive, they can choose to ignore it. And as I said, I have brought grant funding to solve community problems and suggested that we pilot this idea at the highest levels, and it was never done. So let me move on to just speak to some of the other changes.
Just before you move on, Professor Hamilton, you know what amazes me? Is that for many things that are called for, we actually have provision in the law for it. But we have had such a horrible record of implementation and enforcement. And of course, a level of ignorance in the public about the laws and the systems. But I am yet to hear a new call made that has not been made at one time or the other, and some decisions taken. And what the engagement through this process is revealing, that a lot of the frustrations have to do with issues of governance and impunity. And as Dr. Barnett says, people are now believing that it's the actual constitutional reform that will bring the changes. But the Constitution truly cannot resolve all of the issues. The principles have to be built out within ordinary laws, policies, and once built out, they have to be implemented and enforced. So that's the heart of our governance challenge.
Right. Again, we have to be very thoughtful about why we have any persistent implementation challenges, especially with the kind of power we have in the hands of the executive.
I have to say, it's not only about that. As important that point has been made, it's not really just about that. Unfortunately, when you made a point earlier about the importance of the economic context, the need in the context of our people, I think sometimes you said the conversation is too often divorced from the economic reality of the people and the need, what is needed to lift the people. But the truth is that certainly since the time I have been observing it as closely as I've been observing it, there is a whole section of non-performance in government that cannot properly be attributed to omissions in the political directorate, in as much as there are many that you can make the link to. So there is also another kind of conversation that needs to take place for us to achieve the goals.
So you're absolutely right. It's not all concentrated in one place, but I think it boils down to good governance, delivers good policies and laws, and those ultimately underpin the kind of economy that we have. Because the economic rules, the policy decisions, and so on drive economic activity. And unless we see that link, we miss the fact that how we make these decisions impact the type of economy we have. With respect to the other constitutional changes, there's been, of course, a lot in the public domain with respect to the significant salary increases of political directorate since we 16. And one of the things that we felt was important to avoid a repeat of what happened is the establishment of an independent salaries review body with the responsibility for assessing and reviewing salaries based on objective criteria, job responsibilities, qualifications, etc. Such a commission exists in our neighbor, Trinidad and Tobago Salaries Review Commission, and it's rooted in their constitution as well. And we can perhaps look to that approach to avoid what has happened. The removal of parliamentarians have been contentious, but it's certainly something, a loud voice from the citizens saying that we want to have arrangements in place. The promise of an impeachment bill was never actualized, enacted, and so we still have, we in fact have an updated 2021 impeachment bill on the table that provides the opportunity for 1,000 electors to encourage 3 members of parliament to impeach MP, a senator who has breached one of the impeachable offenses, or committed one of these impeachable offenses. So that is something that's being discussed. While the actual experience of impeachment has been small across the world, we think that the process is an effective deterrent, discourages misconduct, and sends an important signal. Sorry? So that's what's supposed to happen.
Let me tell you, Dr. Barnett has expressed very clear views on the call for impeachment.
Yes.
And if you have not yet familiarized yourself with his views, the presentation, the most recent presentation has been archived.
Yes.
It was the 50th anniversary lecture.
I'm aware.
Jambar.
And I'm echoing the views of citizens who feel that that should happen. I think there are other ways, and I mentioned that in terms of the modification of Section 41, because one of the impeachment offenses to not uphold the responsibilities of a member of parliament, if that is clearly defined in the Constitution and added to Section 41, then you may not have to do any impeachment.
So I am all in favor of strong accountability. And in fact, Section 18 of the Local Governance Act provides for impeachment of mayors with a process there. But when you speak about the role of the Member of Parliament, there is a reality that those who are not elected need to become familiar with. The issues in other parts of government have resulted in very interesting dynamics. Constituents expect the Member of Parliament to be all things to them. They expect you to represent all of government. And when you tell them that what they're asking of you is properly assigned to another part of government, they want to hear none of it. So that's an area that we will have to have deeper conversations about. Because a set of constituents can be inflamed and can petition in relation to things that have absolutely nothing to do with your legitimate role. When you don't give them the money for their light bill, give them the money for their hairstyle, give them the money to go and buy rum and drink it, all sorts of things. It's such a harsh reality. Sometimes I wish those who are not members of parliament would spend some more time or some time to understand just how sad the state of affairs is in many, many places. And many of us are not part of the culture that created, or part of, were around to create any culture to say that the answer to that or is because the parliamentarians themselves have done it. Because it doesn't matter where you are, say you step into a representative role, you're stepping into the context of the system until it is changed. Let me tell you, there are some harsh realities there.
Minister, as I listen to you, I can hear Jamaicans saying they wonder and they love some MPs to experience the hard reality of their lives and how some of the decisions that are made impact their lives directly. And so I take your point that it's easy if you're not there to be critical, but I think this is a moment where we have to really rethink the way we've governed and the statements that our members of parliament make to our citizens that builds this expectation that I am your answer.
See, I know that's where we're going to go, but I don't want to derail the presentation because I'd like to hear the rest of it. But just to say that circumstances are not always about the decisions taken. The decisions taken are very important, and in fact, every time I hear the call for strict separation of powers between the executive and the legislature, using myself as an example and as a barometer of data, you know, I believe the insights that I have as an elected MP are such that they enable me to make better decisions. Because when you come into direct contact with the plight of the people, it's very hard for you to come to the decision-making table in the same old way. But the plight of the people is not always about the decisions of others. Sometimes it's their own decisions. Mind you, circumstances can be beyond their control, but there is still a large segment of our population, from what I see, that want to do anything anyhow without any consideration for the consequences, and then believe that it is the duty and the responsibility of the member of parliament to pick up those consequences. Harsh reality, something that will have to be interrogated a lot more.
Absolutely, and you know, obviously we have to take responsibility for our own decisions, but you know, we've seen decades of people who make bad decisions in our context here, and they leave and go overseas, and it's a whole different access to opportunities, etc., etc. So you're right, yes, these individual decisions matter, but context also matter. The recall petitions is, of course, the 1991 Stone report examined that carefully, highlighting the concerns about, you know, the extent to which these recall petitions can be abused, and so that's properly documented, and therefore the adequate safeguards and procedures would be essential if one went that route. The opportunity to perhaps look again at 41 and extend some of the lists for those listening. 41 speaks to the provision in the Constitution that a seat of a member of either house shall become vacant on the specified conditions, and that's detailed. And recently we'll be looking at the issue having to do with the sittings of the house. What is very clear is how opaque, difficult the language is with respect to the standing order 81. That is almost impossible to be clear that, you know, those numbers of missing those seats that you can, in fact, it's very difficult.
Have you checked to see if the provision has ever been used?
Well,
check.
I'm pretty sure, but I would not be surprised if it has never been used because of how onerous the wording is and how difficult it is to become. Absolutely. And so it speaks to it speaks ultimately to the intent of the law. I mean, clearly the intent of the law was not to physically sit in Parliament and to turn up and sign your name and leave, but to actively participate, and therefore, as a mechanism of accountability, clarification of those provisions in the standing order would really help. The fixed election dates, there's a lot that has been said in the public domain there. Clearly a way to provide stability and predictability in the political system, ensure that, you know, there is equal opportunity for candidates and so on to compete, and you know, encourage citizens also to actively participate, because these short announcements, the citizens want to. I actually had the experience where I would have wanted to have organized constituency level discussions so that, you know, people in the constituency can see who we're voting. Let's hear from them and talk to them, and there's just not enough time. So we...
What constituency do you live in, if you don't mind my asking?
West Rural St. Andrew.
Oh, because these four are regularly organized out west, you know.
Well, fair enough, I'm in different constitutions, but I'm talking about citizens organizing.
Citizens.
Yes, and having
Absolutely.
the members of parliament there and so on. And you know,
Regularly done out
it's
on
done,
my side.
it's done in many ways, but I'm just making a simple point that the time not just affects the campaigning, but it affects citizens' actual engagement with much less resources typically than the political parties, and therefore it gives citizens a predictable framework in which they can also organize and actively get involved. The last point is the simplicity of the language. I can say, as somebody who's been trained in the law, I find it very difficult to deal with something, you know, with some provisions in the Constitution. So it's very difficult, and Jamaicans' lack of familiarity and understanding of the Constitution is quite understandable, and therefore I think there must be some effort to really put in that. Let me wrap up now just by making some quick comments about the terms of reference. I think there's a lot that is said to pay attention to public education, and clearly the committee has moved in that direction, but the reference in the Constitution to educate the electorate on the role in the referendum process is clearly inadequate. It needs to go beyond that. And so the terms of reference should speak very explicitly to a more comprehensive education reform process. We join a lot of civil society.
For the committee itself, to do it. I mean, the need is clear. I'm just seeking clarity.
Well, the reference speaks to educate the electorate on the role in the referendum process. It doesn't speak to educating the electorate on issues in the Constitution, the governance arrangement, you know, deepening, understanding the historical, right, those kinds of issues. So it's a much broader agenda than education around the referendum. And yes, so we joined society organizations that call for 1 year of public education on this matter. Clearly, 1 year, 2 years, 10 years is never enough time because these are complex issues, but I think it gives us enough time to really engage.
You don't want any reform in this parliament at all? In effect? No, let's
I think it's not about the time frame for the parliament. It's the reality that this announcement was made last year sometime. I can reference, and I did reference in the document, the efforts of the Advocates Network from June last year. And you were at our first meeting, Minister. We welcomed you. And we would have thought that since then, that program would have been worked out. And so that has been the concern of the length of time it has taken to get comprehensive education reform discussion in the public domain. We see the efforts with respect to the consultations that are taking place, and that's certainly in the right direction.
No denying the need for the public education, no. In fact, the absence of civics in school in a wider context, and just the lack of knowledge around the governance structure has become palpably clearer as we pay closer attention to the issues raised. But I just want to invite you to consider what would be the implication of making no step towards the legislative process of change if this 1 year recommendation were to hold. I just want you to consider that. I'm not necessarily saying answer no.
Okay.
And also to bear in, let me allow you to finish and then
Well, on that point, there's no magic to 1 year. 7 months, 8 months, 16 months. I mean, in other words, what is important is the essence, what is done. And in a world of social media where there's so much learning that's taking place daily, a very intensive education process that is accessible to the people of Jamaica is what is required.
no dispute.
Yeah, so I don't think we should get hooked up on a year.
No.
Yeah, it's a time frame that gives us enough time for engagement.
No, I don't think there can be any dispute about the genuine need for that and the critical importance of it. It's a matter that we regularly discuss here. I'll say some more about it after you concluded your remarks.
And on that matter, of course, we welcome any collaboration. In April 1st, we launched a public engagement entitled Afibi Republic, and a t-shirt is right in the room. We printed t-shirts, right? And the significance of that is we wanted a simple idea out there. This republic belongs to us. If we want a republic that is in our interest, we have to actively create it. And that's a simple message we're saying to Jamaicans. All of us have to actively get involved in shaping this republic. And the Constitution is just one part of that process. The point was made about other legislative changes, but there are institutional changes that need to be made. And we talked about attitudes, mindset shifts, all kinds of things. And so it's us. We have to define that agenda going forward as a people. And so we launched that campaign. It's about public engagement, civic engagement, getting involved, so that when the referendum comes, we will see less than 40% of the electorate turning out. That's what it will take. So we join that effort to say to Jamaicans, get involved, and vote for the future of this country. And we've also, as you know, welcomed the PS, Wayne Robertson and Dr. Nadine Spence at the launch of the Afibi Republic Secondary School debating competition on July 3rd. So we're doing our part, ensuring that young people, especially through the debate process, is engaged. And finally, on the terms of reference, we have documented in our press releases and so on what we see as a lack of transparency with respect to a work plan that was due from March. That's what we observed in the terms of reference, and we've not seen that. More clarification about the phases, because there's not so much clarity as to how long the phases will be. Citizens have been saying more things should be in that phase. For example, from our perspective, those necessary changes should be in phase 1. All right, so some clarification there. The mechanism in which we use all of these submissions and determine the will of the Jamaican people. Not a simple idea. And so some thoughts about how does the committee capture the will of the Jamaican people. That's the weekly update, budget. And we know that there are all kind of budgetary constraints, but we've seen how apparent surpluses have been used recently. And so we wonder, how, in terms of those salary increases, those decisions were made about how to use that. But, the country needs to be educated on this matter. And so, is there budgetary allocation? And if there is, fine. But if there's none, it begs those questions. The opening of the meetings, and of course, we've seen some of the minutes on the website, but there are much more meetings, and so other minutes need to be there. In conclusion, we've tried to point to some necessary changes, and we've identified them as enshrined people in the new constitution, restructuring parliament, strengthening the rights of citizens in petitioning, improving the judiciary, and providing for participatory budgeting. Those are initiatives, and we point to other things that we think are important. The Reviews Commission, removal of parliamentarians, here clarifying that fixed dates, and the simplification of the language in the Constitution. So we're in this ongoing process of studying and dialoguing with other Jamaicans, and we will share these perspectives, we evolve new perspectives, and we're actively engaged in Jamaicans in the diaspora. And in our conversation, many of them are part of our network. They have endorsed the submission and they have expressed specific concerns with respect to diaspora involvement in this process, in the regional reform process. And we've encouraged them, and they've agreed to join other Jamaicans in the diaspora and collectively submit their specific concerns, recommendations, and so on. And there are other issues. We talked about beach rights, we talked about land, and so on. And we think that those will be additional submissions. We understand the complexity. I heard the points you're raising earlier, and we will want to make additional submissions in the future. Thanks again for the opportunity to present. Thank you.
Right, let me thank you so much on behalf of the committee before opening up for comments and questions. Thank you so much. Lolita?
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Hamilton and team, thank you very much. This has been the long awaited presentation, at least from my end. So I do have a number of questions. I'm just asking us to make some judges. You don't think we should respond to them one by one. First of all, let me say that the presentation to me highlights the common concerns of Jamaicans, and that the concerns that you have raised and some of the recommendations are matters that have been deliberated within this committee as well, and have also been submissions from other groups. It says to me that Jamaicans have a common concern or common concerns about common things as it relates to constitutional reform, the supremacy of the people of a country as we progress along this path. I want to have one of a few questions has to do with the oversight committees of the House, because I know that Minister did indicate what the current status quo is in relation to committees, and I wonder, and perhaps it's there and I missed it. For example, who selects the members of these committees, and to whom do they really report, especially within the context of people supremacy? So how would it work practically? And I also just wanted to underscore the point that it also appears that many of the issues that are arising are not arising because of the lack of policy or legislation, but more so the lack or inadequacy of the implementation and accountability. And I also concur with the point that accountability is also our business as a people, in the sense that we also do things that are just what we learn to do. We go to vote regardless. You know, and to me, if we all agree here about the supremacy of the people of Jamaica, that there must also be new paradigms in terms of how we exercise that supremacy, because it cannot be business as usual, and a revised constitution is not going to vest in us that active power outside of the words. I just wanted to say that. So in respect of the committees, I had just who do they report to, who selects them, and I was just wondering if the committees from an accountability perspective are also non-functional in terms of what is their role, what is the next level, what happens after that. So we put them in and we say, you're supposed to do this and you're supposed to do that, as it relates to almost every entity in government. And the fact that the committees fail to be as accountable as we want them to be, how does that accountability framework work itself out in reality? I also saw the note of the minority rights, and I have a particular interest, from my recognition background, etc., in terms of who do we define as minorities, because I noticed that in the same paragraph we speak to marginalized groups and things. So I was wondering if we were using the terms interchangeably. The issue of the senators, say 30 years and older, I know that figure has to do with maturity, but I wanted to know if there was a rationale for age 30. What is your magic to age 30? In terms of the Jamaican president as head of state, we have had numerous submissions on that, and I think your submissions are consistent with much of what has been presented. I also wanted to touch on the piece of the preamble, because that's an area that we have discussed here. In fact, Dr. Barnett from day one did mention the preamble, the minister herself. We actually even thought about the language of the preamble. You know, when the UA's linguistic department came and spoke about the role of language and indigenous language, and our earlier presenter this morning actually spoke about language and the notion of how other constitutions, other countries treat with language as a constitutional right. That we actually also discussed how do we reflect, you know, the preamble. Do we have it, for example, in Jamaican, and do we have it also in English? So the whole notion of the preamble and what it does for us as a people, that this is our constitution, has actually been discussed at length as well. So I actually do welcome that. The supremacy of the people, I don't think there's any disagreement, because if we go to Republic, then that's really what we're saying. But I think we need to come up with mechanisms. What are the new paradigms that will dictate how we as a people exercise our supremacy? Because that is part of how we do that today, is really a part of our cultural heritage. What we have inherited, what we see ourselves, etc. How we see ourselves going forward. What are the intergenerational issues that we need to implement? Are these matters for the Constitution, or are these matters of policy, etc., and legislation? So how do we move the people? So when we wave on new Constitution, whatever that is, and we know that we're doing it in phases, what does that say for us as a people? Is this not going to automatically change who we are as a people and how we see ourselves? Granted, the process is extremely important. As I said, I have quite a lot, but I'm sure my other colleagues have many other questions. The issue of participatory budgeting, I fully understand the concept referred to before, and I think one of the issues for us as a people is defining the guidelines as to how you operate within a particular construct. It's like giving discretion to someone and saying, this is how you exercise your discretion. Because discretion at large also has to be exercised within boundaries. So when we talk about participatory budgeting, there must be clear parameters in terms of what does actually that mean, what does it mean, how do you arrive at consensus? You know, what is it that you give to the MP in terms of monitoring assets for a community, and what can that do? Because I think we all understand how that actually works in reality. And you did mention the notion of how do communities engage with civil society groups? Because you gave some examples, and it's not novel. We have heard many stories before, groups coming in, wanting to facilitate, but there is just the facilitation just there. And Dr. Barnett also in one of his earlier submissions, also mentioned the whole notion of, I think he was dealing with petitioning. How does it work? Because it's not that these things don't exist. Because I also noted that the issue of people participation in the development of legislation, it happens. I'm not sure, Minister, if there are strict rules. In other words, the bill is always out there for public comment. And sometimes people will come to Parliament or legislative committees to make presentations. Is it that we need to change those rules in terms of how that participation is implemented within the national construct? How do you get a group, for example, from rural Jamaica to come in and make a presentation? What is it that we really want to see? I think I'll stop there. The public education program, I think we have flagged that 1,000 times for us that the poor horse is limping now. And because in this committee, we have flagged that horse. And I think it will be reflected in our minutes when the minutes are there. And I know, though, that you, and I'm looking at page, I think my page number fell off, but it's actually item 3, lack of transparency, and item G, make publicly complete unredacted minutes of all the proceedings. I think Minister will speak to that, because we do have the minutes of the meetings, and we also do have the verbatim which will come back to the Hansard. Thank you very much.
It's not so much about redacting it, but we felt that may be more helpful in putting out the notes not to have attributions except where certain points are made, because we do not want the free flow of conversations to be impacted by any fear that in this age of social media people will hang on to what is said without a fuller appreciation of the context. So I know we often react negatively to certain things, but insofar as this committee is concerned, we have operated in a context of candor, where everyone speaks freely, where all views contend, we listen to each other. Members come to the table not only reflecting their personal perspective, but also the perspectives as they understand them of the groups they represent. It's as much as the public wants to know everything, sometimes it's not the wisest route to indicate who says what. If you, for example, sit in your meetings and you are discussing robustly what is going on, it may not always be helpful to say it was Rosalea who said this and not, this person or that person, because broader context matters for discussion. There is no intention to hide anything. That's why we are creating historical records, verbatim transcripts. And while those are being done, we also give the main points of discussion. But I really would want to clarify that there is and was never any intention to operate in a way that shut out the public. In this age, there is still a place for conversations and deliberations outside of the cacophony that's taking place. And that does not equate to secrecy at all.
Should I respond to that? We start with the oversight committees. Clearly these are House rules, so we expect that members of Parliament will make those decisions. I think one of the rules that I think ought to be clear is that the executive should not be a part of those committees. If it's an oversight of the executive action. And so those rules need to be decided by the House. And once
the rules actually specified. The rules actually specified, but a convention developed, notwithstanding. So the rules indicate that the committees are comprised of non-ministers.
okay, and so
It's in the standing orders.
Okay.
But like I say, over time, I'm not sure, it's something that I'm actually investigating. What I'm told so far, it was in an attempt to bring some clarity. The executive members are not usually cabinet members, but some are state ministers. But I don't think it's difficult to appreciate that if the objective is to have oversight, then you may want to address anything that may present a conflict in ensuring that that goal is achieved.
Right.
Unfortunately, a lot of the standing orders are honored in breach instead of observance. Very unfortunate. It's a point I make all the time.
Right, and so those are the issues that have to be addressed. And I think it's the long tradition that we've had of the dominance of the executive in Parliament, setting parliamentary agenda, and the idea that the MPs vote typically along party lines. Now, there's no simple fix. We've had this tradition. I think the question becomes, how do we put rules in place such that there's real accountability? And it includes the accountability of our Prime Minister. I mean, we've seen in other jurisdictions, and we have the provision in Section 71, that the non-executive members, members of the ruling administration, can move a vote of no confidence. Is that ever possible in our jurisdiction? And so it raises those issues of the extent
It
to which...
has happened certainly since I have been in the Parliament. vote of no confidence been moved? It has happened.
In terms of actual
Whether it
removal,
yielded the
absolutely.
result. Well, I mean, the vote
Right,
is another matter.
Right.
The fact that you do not sometimes get the required vote is a point made by some researchers to say that in a reality, you may have a process that becomes more political because of how the votes will be counted at the end of the day.
Well, of course,
But the process of moving a no confidence vote sometimes is just as powerful as the outcome because of the issues that are raised in the process. But I've experienced it since I've been in the parliament, not in the House of Representatives.
right, and in addition to that, the idea that coming out of these investigations of what's happening in the ministries for government, the reports are there, the sanctions, the decisions that can curb some of these actions from continuing is missing. And it boils down to those decisions in the full house coming out from the committee reports. It's not there.
You know, there's a sad reality. I have been threatening internally in my ministry to speak publicly about certain issues because some members of the political directorate may trespass over boundaries, but there are some who respect the boundaries. I can tell you that I have had such frustrating experience in having people held to account for their failures that I've recently said that I'm now at my principled limit and I'm not going to keep quiet on these issues. Simple things. But it is the simple things that people get away with that empower them to do the bigger things. Believe me when I tell you the problem is not unique to the political directorate. And saying that it exists everywhere is not necessarily a consolation, because it is a real problem that needs to be addressed. But it is so much bigger than you think it is. That right now, personally, we're in a context where people believe that the buck stops with the minister and the minister must take responsibility for the omissions of other people. Well, government is not a one-man show. And every time we turn the spotlight on one, others are in the dark. So it's a deep, deep, deep-seated problem. Issues around accountability and impunity. It's really bad.
Okay, so Minister, we can agree on that it's very bad and we have to do something if we want to improve governance. And to your point about the accountability, it's not just about legislators holding the executive accountable, but also about people holding the representative accountable. And so that's why this civic engagement is critical. These are habits that we've developed, and I remind people when we talk about these issues that our constitution and the institution of governance were never set up to involve the people from inception. We've had to tinker with it since 62, right? Norman Manley said 90% of the constitution was what was carried on prior with the colonial administration. So you have an arrangement that was never about seeing the average Jamaican as somebody who ought to be an integral part of the governance arrangement. So I think that's the hurdle that we have and we have to overcome it. So it's there, it's embedded in our families and so on. We have a very authoritarian culture. And we don't question authority. So we have to root all of this out in order to hold people we put in power to act on our behalf at all levels, in our civic organizations, in our churches, etc. So it's not a simple problem. So I take your point that it does require a new paradigm. It includes, I think, also in terms of the broader governance arrangement, new arrangements and thinking within the political parties, who we also see tend to replicate this kind of top-down approach to their operations, and that habit and approach to governance is taken into governance. So yes, I agree with you. With respect to the minority, and yes, the language there may be a little confusing. The thinking there is this. In fact, just yesterday, I heard on the news about a child got a scholarship but had special needs and the difficulty of that school. And I immediately thought, what if that child came from a rural community, and not only was the school not configured, but just access in terms of road access and so on to that school is 10 miles, tough terrain, health issues, parents incapacity to afford it, another neglect. And so it begs the question, and it's really an opportunity to think about the extent to which we could pay some focus in how we shape law and make policy, especially through developmental lens, to ensure that every citizen has an opportunity to be empowered and to develop and grow. So that was the thinking there, and does require more elaboration and thought. But if we're talking about equal opportunities and rights and so on, that was something that we thought should be part of the definition of the rules and responsibility, I would say. With respect to seniority, yes, that's about experience and the timing. I mean, a longer period of time, say 6 years, the continuity and all of that. No magic to age 30, and no magic to age for that matter. But the idea of experience, quality experience that can move from administration to administration is the thinking there. Absolutely agree with your point on the preamble. Yes, making the preamble in patois is a great idea, as well as our standard English, but certainly getting the voices of Jamaicans who have aspirations and dreams about the kind of Jamaica we want. The mechanisms for people's sovereignty, in fact, the suggestion is that it ought to be a preamble. Not the details, but just, it's a very good question. And the provisions of what that actually means ought to be clarified, because as you said, there's no disagreement that in a democracy and what we want in our republic ought to be people's sovereignty. But we've inherited an arrangement, we're here now, it's not quite there, and the question is what additional mechanisms, and that's one of the reasons I think provisions like the right to petition gets people in the conversation. Again, to come back to that minority view, when we make legislation, we have the entire civil service that will provide technical advice to the executive and so on, and we shape law. What typically is missing is the experiential reality of ordinary people. What does that mean? So we have great plans for infrastructure, say. Recently I had experience out in St. Thomas. And I'm saying, do people really understand the dust nuisance and what it means to live in that environment? Sorry?
Yes, we understand.
Yeah.
Yes, we understand.
Fair enough,
but people who are contracted disregard it and make promises that they don't deliver.
Yeah, so I'm just using it by way of example, and I think I hear from your passion, your concern, like all of us, about the impact on the average citizen. So I understand. The question is that we have great macro plans, but the micro impact and implications of those plans for people are sometimes missed. And so there's an opportunity for people to come to Parliament and say, hey, this is what is happening. And I mean, in the case of St. Thomas, that's known as there. So what happens if it's having an effect in some rural community and nobody hears about it? The voice gets lost. So that's the idea of ensuring that we have those mechanisms in place. The participatory budgeting arrangements, I agree, clear guidelines, and there are many models all over the place, but let's make the rules very clear. And I think, again, consistent with the rule of law, that's what we want. And once we have that, then it can be done. And I think, for me, the issue really is the confidence in our people. Because as long as we feel that the MPs or others will make better decisions than the people, then we perpetuate the status quo. But I think if you are completely confident that the wisdom, that collective wisdom of people who have knowledge that people who don't even live in those communities have, they understand. I have been there, I've had those dialogues, and I've heard perspectives that certainly get to the root cause in ways that are peculiar to those communities that those of us who don't live there can't understand. And I think we need to give them a voice. And those are some mechanisms in which we can get an expression of people's sovereignty. And then your last point speaks to participation in lawmaking.
Professor Hamilton, what do you see that prevents the people from having their voices heard?
They don't believe that they're heard. So we give them these opportunities, and we see that they, a good example is the recent salary increase. There's been loud noises about that. Nothing happened. And so yeah, well, heard but not really heard. Right. So I think that's the issue, Minister. Let me say, I understand that there's no simple
issue at this time, but soon enough I will let my voice be heard. But right now, I know that no perspective from the political directorate is going to be welcomed by the people.
Yes, but let me say though, effective dialogue, and I can speak, we've been active in the advocacy. There are very few, if any, Jamaicans I've heard that says their political directorate does not deserve an increase. So the issue is the scale. The issue is the scale. And so if we have some movement on that scale, then we would know that our voices are heard. And it will encourage more Jamaicans to speak up.
I think it is, if I could, not only the scale, but the whole mechanism.
Yes. And again, why we've suggested a mechanism in place that could be better. And the question is, will that mechanism be put in place? And if not, our voices are not heard.
Keep the faith. Keep the faith.
Okay.
All right.
So
keep the faith, Rosalie.
Yeah, on that point, and let me make a last point there in terms of your voice heard with respect to budgets. The IMF has evolved codes of fiscal transparency and so on. The IMF themselves in those codes have suggested to governments that we make the budget not only transparent, but that there's active participation in the process. So I think that when we get to these budget decisions, members of parliament ought to be involved in terms of taking the voice of the people, but the opportunities for Jamaicans to have a say in those decisions need to be there. And therefore, if we know that, if we fulfill these requirements to complete a petition, we will be heard. I suspect that many members of the Advocates Network will get their voices heard. Right now, and I can just say one point on that, we have actively tried to use the online petition and have been frustrated. And we're not the only, and I'm not talking about the current one, I'm talking about many years ago. I have been part of actively trying to use it. We've been frustrated, and there are other citizens that complain. It's not a right, it's an option. And so we want to know if we fulfill these rules, we have a right to speak, and that we have an opportunity.
Let me just tell you something exciting that is happening around people having a say in the budget. The IMF and the World Bank established a parliamentary network in 2000. And over the decades, lots of changes have taken place. But right now, where the minds have met is that there has to be a process in each member country where World Bank funded projects actually have a direct impact on the people in a new and different way. So I believe that
And I think it's a positive direction. And in the parliamentary network,
members are present as the representatives of their constituents and not necessarily the government. So a lot of concerns have been raised at the international financial institution level about how ministries of finance actually go about determining priorities. And I think that it's an emerging area to look out for. Bigger conversations will be happening in short order.
Absolutely, I'm quite happy to hear that.
So your thinking is already recognized in areas where budgets, the spend is of primary consideration.
It's been around for a long time, the fiscal transparency
But
code.
we're almost there.
Yes.
Because Jamaica has been assessed actually in a new and different way,
Right.
coming across administrations around the fiscal stability rules, the discipline around the debt to GDP ratio, and ensuring that the budget process actually takes place ahead of the start of the financial year.
Absolutely.
We still have a long way to go,
Right.
but we're nowhere near where we
Right.
were. And the progress is palpably clear.
Quite so, and I think just so people know that the actual language of these codes speak to not only the opportunity to participate in budget deliberations, but a formal voice in budget deliberations. And I think that's really what is being required, and it's consistent with the idea that you want that formal arrangement to have a voice on other matters. Yes, I mentioned the age zone magic.
So, again, thanks for the presentation. I had a question as you were especially discussing those matters related to oversight and greater people involvement in governance generally. A point that I agree with and support. I remember some years ago with the 51% coalition, we started this business of building knowledge about the budget processes and critiquing the budget from the perspective of people generally, but women in particular, looking at how the budget, if we were to use a gender lens to look at it, how the budget would look from our perspective, particularly the perspective of women and children. So I agree with that fully. But I wanted to talk about the other broader issues of governance and people's involvement and the voice of the citizen in participation. And there's something that I discovered some years ago when I really started to pay attention to the particular ways that people could participate in our current governance arrangement. And it led me then to conclude that there are mechanisms in place, I'm not saying they're perfect, but there are mechanisms in place now that can facilitate people participation. But very, very few of the citizens are aware of how they can. Which led me to my next point. Even if we put in place the most perfect system of participation, if there is no mechanism to ensure that the average citizen is fully aware of where they can intervene in the governance process, how do we ensure that the system works? So the issue for me, yes, it's the kind of system, but more importantly, it's how do we get to the knowledge of where people's voices and presence can be inputted in the governance structure. How do we get that knowledge to the people, and who has the responsibility for it, and who has the responsibility to fund it, and where in the current system, and if it's not in the current system, what do we put in place to ensure that people know? Because it don't matter what system. Even if we gather in the town square in the morning and make all the decisions that must be done by 12 o'clock, people don't know where they know the address and don't have the means to get there, will not be able to participate. Right? So what then is the mechanism that ensures that people know that they can participate, where they should participate, and how they should participate?
I would say that the most important answer is the experience of participating. What does that look like? And for people who I've engaged, fear is real. and their experience of talking out and the consequences that flow from that, whether it's in their jobs, whether it is in relationships they have and so on, is real. I've noticed that for decades in Jamaica. And those of us who speak out are fearless. And we're not too worried about the consequences. Some people are because they're dependent on a job in government, say, or they're dependent on their economic well-being for others. And so there's fear. So I want to put that on the table. So the actual experience can be improved, and that's why I repeated the point. When the country begins to see that when we are very active and we stand up firmly on an issue, that the government listens, that will change. In fact, I have quoted time and time again those experiences where our government listened. And one of the most recent examples is in that song competition. Jamaican people said, no, we're not going to 60 years without a festival song. And that changed. And so on. So the more Jamaicans see that, the more we get to that. It's the responsibility of all of us. There is a responsibility of government, and if you think about public education, that's how I see it. We have, as citizens, we're not funded, we get occasional funds, but all of this is volunteer time. Right? But we're committed because we believe that we can create a better Jamaica when we all actively get involved in sharing ideas and educating. It's not just the job of the government. However, the government can put their hands on funding to put a sizable enough budget in place to fund a serious education program. And it's when we try as citizens and we can't sustain it, there's inadequate funding to civil society organizations, as you know very well, in the work you've done. It weakens our hands and weakens our capacity to join this effort to make change. And so I think, last point on that, opening these opportunities is not about getting 90 or 100% of citizen participation. It will never happen. The experience of other countries like Sweden and other those countries that have referendum every Monday morning, right? Very frequently, not literally. Sometimes typically less than 50% of the population turn out. In fact, I was doing some research on recall experience in places like Germany, and you see that the very threshold to be able to recall a member of parliament based on the number of petitions that's required typically is not met. So the issue is not so much that citizens won't participate, but that citizens have an opportunity to participate. Because on issues that really matter, I believe the Jamaican people will.
All right, yes.
I think another question that was asked, and the answer you gave, raised an important issue about how do we create a democratic culture. So often you see an incident take place that is outrageous in the backwards of St. Mary. People who have had similar experiences in Trelawney or St. Elizabeth, they don't respond to support somebody who has stood out to country, and that weakens the resolve of other people who rise up and speak out against an oppressive act. It may not necessarily coming from the state. And that is part of our problem is that we need to spend some, not just financial resources, but some of our mind resources as to how we can create a democratic culture where people stand up and support others when they have the courage to stand up and speak up. And I think an important part of the information process, the public education process, has to be aware of the urgency of creating a democratic culture. So that early on today, Madam Chair, I heard discussions about the need to focus attention on those aspects of the Constitution that are going to go to a referendum where the people will be directly involved. What we were not, it may have been in some people's mind, but it was not expressed, is that even on those other aspects of the Constitution in which people are not going to be directly involved in terms of voting, the resources of the state, that program which was outlined by the Jamaican Information Service, which we have not yet implemented, needs to focus on informing people, not just because they're going to ultimately have to vote or be asked to vote, but it is their right to know what is going on. And some of the points that were made by Professor Hamilton in the summary part of her presentation speak to matters that fall within that category. So that in paragraph 3, just before the summary concluding remarks, there are a number of things here about which we understand sometimes get a little bit defensive. But what is happening is that out there in the public, people are conflating the limited information that is coming out with particular points of view that we are all together. They have no idea that in the community there is a variety of points of view. It's very important that people understand, yes, we must not be afraid of diversity. And if that is not understood as part of deepening the democratic culture, then we are in deep, you know what.
I fully support that point, and again, I want to emphasize what mentioned earlier, because I think when we're talking about government and governance, that culture can be built in the political parties, where people are not afraid to speak. I say this all the time to my friends who are aligned to the different political parties. I said, you should be the loudest voice out there when the government you voted in, the administration you put in, is not doing what you want done. But people even within the party is feeling afraid, intimidated, fearful of speaking out. So part of that reversal of that culture is the tolerance to competing ideas and to be able to disagree. One of the guiding principles we have in the Advocates Network is that we will respect our differences. And that where there are differences, we respect a different point of view, but we work together on the areas we agree on. And there are many differences, but that we understand there are some core issues that we have to come together on. And last point of that, one way, and this is beginning to happen, maybe it's just changing, that we were surprised in our advocacy that there were members of the civil service and other people who were afraid to speak out, who quietly said to us, keep going, don't stop. And that kept us going because we know we were speaking for others who were fearful. And the very fact that they dared to reach out speaks volume. So perhaps the culture is changing. And so we have to keep pushing, recognizing where this has come from. Our history was such that dissent to the status quo meant you would be killed. That's our history. We were punished severely for challenging the status quo. So I agree with you, we have to deliberately change this, and it means dedicated resources and very strategic interventions to those.
appreciate your presentation on behalf of the team. I just wanted to for my own mind, just to clarify where there's, let me call it agreement, and just telescope one particular area. So, in a general sense, you're supportive of a parliamentary republic.
Some of us in the network, yes.
And also supportive of a Jamaican president as head of state.
Yes.
And that a head of state should be nominated, appointed by Parliament, 2/3 majority, Senate and the lower house.
Different views on that.
Different views on that. Okay. You have telescoped the whole idea of accountability in governance as a critical factor to be addressed. And in addressing that, you have pointed to the importance of oversight committees. Have you considered the issue of whether parliamentarians should be ministers of government as one way in which there can be some kind of balancing or separation of powers? And if so, what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so it gets to the heart of that issue of presidential republic versus a parliamentary one. And there are some who feel that we should be bold enough to try. There are others who have looked at the experience of other countries. And as I mentioned in the paper, Sri Lanka is a good example of a country who moved away from a parliamentary system and seeking to come back to a parliamentary system. The important point is, from my perspective, is that none of these systems are problem-free. They have flaws. And a lot depends on who is in office. Americans are now grappling with the limits of their system of democracy and the rule of law, given their experience of different presidents. So I think we should learn from that. But for me, perhaps the most important lesson is our own experience and what we have seen. So, for example, Jamaicans say, let's elect a president. Are we not doing that indirectly when we vote? We kind of campaign for the leader. So we kind of understand that's what we're doing. And in spite of that, we see, for all kinds of other reasons, a very strong prime minister who, if we have another type of prime minister who could go to the limits of those powers, we would see something else. And I think that it's the extent to which within our culture, we just talked about, not very democratic, authoritarian, we know it, we see it in our families, we see, I keep repeating this, Jamaicans understand authoritarian culture, we live it every day. That's why we have so much abuse in this country. And so when you put more powers, all the powers of a presidency, plus the powers of what we know to be a prime minister who runs government, in one person, you have the opportunity of abuse. And the kind of behavior we've seen in other countries, and I think there are lessons to learn.
My specific question will relate to not so much the presidency, okay?
Separate, yes, sorry.
Yeah.
So for me, when again in observing other countries, what you see is that when you have that separation, you have the legislature they have typically very strong base from which they derive their power. And it includes people who financially can support them. You have a greater capacity for them to stand up and make decisions. I fear that in a culture where the very active people who go out and vote, many are still not economically reliant on anyone else but the very political process that we're supporting in many cases. We have a problem. And so I think we have to be careful that we don't create an arrangement where, yes, the separation exists, but that the independence that you want doesn't have the economic base on which to act in the way we would want. So if we take that as data, let me say, my own understanding of where we are is that for us to improve this economy, it's not going to be simple. If we were to double our GDP, we have about 5,000 US dollars a year. We will still not get to half of the world average in terms of standard of living. We have a lot of work to do. And so I don't see in the near future the level of strength in the economy that can provide the base for legislators across the country to stand up and act in that independent way.
Thank
And
you
so,
for the clarity of your explanation. And what you have made clear in some of the things that you have emphasized, that the reform of the system is not a question of changing the Constitution. And I think this has been emphasized over and over. Because some people believe that you can achieve socio-economic reform, you can beat democracy, and you can do all sorts of things merely by changing the form of the Constitution. But at the basis of it will be the way in which you administer power and become accountable. So that a lot of people say, let us have a presidential form. But they don't tell you what are the powers of the president. They don't tell you what powers that person is going to have. They don't mention the fact that emphasizing personality is a danger to democracy. So that I'm very impressed by the balance of the presentation. But I want to ask you this. Because the experience of most countries that have had constitutional reform is that the electorate, where the reform proposals have to be submitted to a referendum, the electorate tends to be very conservative. And attempts at reform which are subject to the approval of the people fail over and over when too many different things are presented. Especially in a multi-party system where you don't get the parties agreeing. It is almost destined to fail. If you were to identify the things which we ought to do and which we can obtain consensus on, what would those things be?
So I take the point that, making the thing too complex could well be an issue, but I do think that one of the reasons we wanted to frame it as necessary, important changes is in there are some critical things that must be clear. And if they're not going to be on the referendum in the first round, then it must be clear to the Jamaican people that it's coming. So that roadmap of where we're going need to be there. However, among the critical, I would suggest, is this idea of how we rethink the parliamentary arrangement. And that's the voice of Jamaicans saying, let's think about whether we put an elected president or not in place. That's what people are saying. So in there has to be some clarity that we are going to change the structure of governance. I think without that, we've waited long, we've seen a lot of what has happened in other countries, and we're seeing that the simple removal of the king is not enough. People need to feel more, and I would then suggest that that's something that we all should exercise our minds around. What will convince all of us that things will be different, that governance will be different. And while I agree with you, Dr. Barnett, that this is not about solving the Jamaicans' problem by changing the constitution, but it's the clutch of issues and arrangements that flow from those constitutional arrangements that matter. They have implications for how we restructure our institutions, to how we think the approaches that we've used in the past around a range of issues. And so I think that's why there's a lot of attention there. And if in the deliberation, for example, on the matter of the participatory budgeting, I'd be happy if there is dedicated legislation. Right now, there's none. So it's neither here nor there in a fundamental sense. My preference is to see to the Constitution because it says we're serious. And it has more weight. And I think for a lot of the other issues that Jamaicans are talking about, they may raise it in this constitutional debate, not necessarily that it's there in the Constitution, but that somewhere it ends up as something important, either ordinary legislation or in some policy or something.
If I may at this time, Professor Hamilton, I think your presentation was really balanced and a lot of food for thought, and things that we can examine. I just want to, however, make reference to the impeachment aspect that you have made reference to. If I'm understanding clearly, you're still not too happy with the fact that this is an area that we have not really activated as much as we should. However, what I'm thinking, what are some of your thoughts then in terms of how we could really have some teeth into this area?
Yes.
To make it really effective?
Right.
Yes.
Let's start with the current conversation about codes of conduct. Right? So, if we agree, just to make this as an example, because we're seeing now the country is seeing that we're not seeing frequency of the sittings of Parliament. And if we agree that frequency in the sittings of Parliament matter, if you are a legislator, then let's clarify the language right now. We don't need a lot of hullabaloo about that. We can just clarify the language, make it very clear that if you miss 6 sittings, right, without permission, then you can lose a seat, something like that. Very clear. I say that because one of the impeachable offenses is in fact that you are not, I don't have the word in front of me, but you don't uphold your responsibilities as a member of Parliament. And if we define it as such, then that's very clear. So we don't need to go through an impeachment proceeding for that particular offense. There may be others that one would have to debate, whether we need due process and so on. But on matters of issues that is easily definable, you're either in Parliament or you're not. And if you're required to be there for X number of time, and you're not, and there's no valid excuse, then you vacate the seat. There's no need for an impeachment.
That's a disqualification.
Yes. So that's where I would go. And the reason the impeachment is in this document is because both the administration and the opposition have made public statements to this country about an impeachment process. So if it is that there's a change of mind about an impeachment process, and that, for example, codes of conduct will be used in place, because that's now to be part of a joint civil committee, then a clear statement needs to be made on that we're going to abandon this impeachment, we're going to codes of conduct, and that we will settle this matter of whether you can lose your seat if you breach these rules, and the details of rules can be subject to the House rules.
Yeah, but the current situation with respect to missing sittings is facilitated by the very point you made. Parliament does not meet. And so the current situation, under the current rules, you do not have the mechanism to really get out of Parliament, remove from Parliament, people who are not attending. And this business of an excuse, they put forward the excuse in order to justify their not being there. And there are different rules that deal with whether or not you get subsistence for being there, and what happens when you are absent from Parliament. That needs to be simplified.
Absolutely.
And Parliament just needs to sit more often. And then Parliament sits for 4 hours for a week. And then there's legislation that piles up and piles up and piles up at the end of the parliamentary year. It has to be reintroduced the following year. What are the rules, for example, of whips? They have no responsibilities. They don't really make sure that their responsibility is not just an appointment, but that I am going to ensure, I'm going to carry out the responsibilities to the Parliament that will demonstrate to the people that that particular office is fulfilling a role that brings in line the conduct of members who are elected by the elected to sit in Parliament.
So I wanted to follow up on that because you said 2 things, Hugh, that it is assumed that the populace knows, for example, that there's something in Parliament called a whip. 3/4 plus the other 1/4 of us have no idea where that means or what. That's what I meant when I said, even if we decide to come up with a system where we meet in the town square at 10 o'clock every morning to decide on the budget for the day, if we do not develop a mechanism to teach people how our politics works, that's what I meant here. Yes. People will not know how to participate. Right. And if we do not find a way to facilitate people's participation, meaning some people will need bus fare, or some people will need bus, we will not get a system that works. So when you mentioned, for example, that at the end of the parliamentary year, if an issue is placed on the parliamentary calendar, and it's not addressed, it's going to have to be reintroduced next year. I learned that when we were having the abortion debates. And I was saying, so how come, what happened to it? And the people say, you have to find a way to get it reintroduced. And I was calling Parliament, calling Dr. Chang or Mr. Bartlett, who I think, or, to find out, so how do I get it back on the agenda? And then I started to hear a lot of things, and I was like, I didn't know, I still have no idea how it works. And it doesn't seem to be written anywhere, so that I, who did 2 degrees in political science, including comparative politics, have no idea how our parliament works. So even if we decide at 10 o'clock in the mornings to gather in the town square of each parish and be as direct in our democracy as possible, if we only share that information with a select few, we will not have the kind of participatory democracy that we want. So my question is, beyond this conversation here, and even with the system that we now have, which allows for some degree of participation that most people don't know, how do we ensure that people know and know how their voices can be facilitated in the parliamentary system? We're going to change it, and I don't even know with my 2 degrees in politics how, who a whip is in our party, or even that a whip existed. You know what I mean? That, I think to me, that to me is the greatest issue, that no matter what we have, we can easily write the rules and lock it up in a book, and people won't know. How do we get Jamaicans to know?
But that's fundamentally about policy, isn't it? Right? So, we can put policy in place.
Just have to
Right, so in listening to all of the conversations since this morning, what I'm seeing that is required is a paradigm shift right across the board. A mindset of our citizens to become truly involved, not just having side talks and coming up with their own conclusions. It sometimes does not really is informed by what is really happening. And I see a lot of that happening, and it pains my heart sometimes. So we need to have the citizens to have that that desire to become involved. There's also the need, and it is coming out more and more as we move from parish to parish with these engagements, that we need to be educating our citizens. They want to become involved in the process, but we need to create the environment to allow for them to become involved so that they can be truly informed as to what is happening. It also requires, again, this has been said time and time again, for the reintroduction of civics within our school system, so that the children can understand the whole operations of governance and government and all of that. And also the whole thing of accountability at all levels, starting from the whole right up to the very top, accountability, and then the important issue of implementation, because a lot of policies have been put in place, rules, regulations, but what we find is that the baton has dropped at the implementation level. And so your presentation, which covers a lot of things that should be done, could be done, will only become a talk piece if the actual implementation does not take place. So all of us have that responsibility to make sure that we have said that these are things that can be put in place. We also now need to follow through with the implementation of it.
Just quickly, I'm going to ask my colleague to add to it. That's one of the reasons we had said that the terms of reference that speaks to the referendum is clearly inadequate. We talked about the role of the citizen in a democracy. That's what we're talking about. So the public education has put in context the role of the citizen actively shaping the Constitution and beyond. And so, yes, that's why it's important.
There are two quick points that I wanted to make. Several persons have talked about education in a narrow context in terms of what the community is doing, and others have expanded the idea to about education in a broader sense that the citizens need to be engaged on. And you, of course, expanded that a bit further. And I am completely in agreement with all of that. I am suggesting that the committee will powerful folks, including the minister and persons who are influential in the country, that in the process of considering the pathways that you need to develop to educate and involve citizens, that we think about it not just in terms of education, but also education and to collect information as well from citizens that will influence decisions. I'm sure that's probably how we think about it, but I want to suggest that there are some very crucial institutions and organizations in Jamaica that have the ability to influence the country. And it's unclear to me that you have considered including them as parts of your process. I speak of, for example, the Media Association, which represents the traditional media organizations, the specific media houses, the RGR Group, IRIF, and so on. In addition to the traditional media, you have very, very influential social media individuals and groups who put out blogs and so on, who are very influential. Then you have people within communities that are very influential in terms of putting on the agenda of people, educating people on issues that concern your group. And it would seem to me that you may want to consider having individual meetings with these organizations to determine how they can help to get the education component done effectively because based on what I have seen, yes, Minister, there are robust discussions, but it is unclear that they're sufficiently wide and sufficiently dispersed for them to be sufficiently influential. So that and there are ways to engage these organizations that would not require as much of a budget as we might consider. There are budgetary considerations, but there are public service announcements that organizations can do and will do if approached in the right way as a national issue rather than for them to be politicized. It's just one suggestion. The other issue for me now, and I'm sure for others, is as we look at the reform issues and get down into the nitty-gritty and some of the details that need to be in the Constitution and what goes to the public and elsewhere. One issue, when you pull the lens back, that is crucial for me is, as Rosie said earlier, is to root our thinking in our history. We are where we are because we're a product of a particular history. And that history has created certain legacies, and two legacies that are crucial that we saw. One is an understanding of that history which has been dropped. We don't teach history and civics anymore. Those need to happen again. And secondly, in the issue of financial, money, assets, equity, that is a component of almost all the harm and issues, crime and the rest of them, that is rooted in our history. And if we, so I would encourage your team, when you put together all of your details, that you pull back the lens to look at whether or not you're addressing the issue of, to use the old-time phrase, the haves and the have-nots, and how do we figure out to use the Constitution and every other means that we have available to close that gap between those who have inherited the have and continue to latch onto it and keep the others out of being able to access ways out of poverty.
Just to quickly address the matter concerning public education, and I want to commend you, Prof, for that comprehensive and thought-provoking presentation. For the avoidance of doubt, there is a public education plan in place, developed by the Jamaica Information System, JIS, Service. In fact, this was developed in March prior to the establishment of the Constitutional Reform Committee, because we envisaged that we would need such a proposal. However, when the committee was constituted, we required enough time. At the time, we required significant time to allow the committee to be established. The subcommittee, Public Education and Communication, was subsequently established, chaired by Dr. Nathan Spence, focusing significantly on this area. We allowed the members to, internalize the contents therein and provide their feedback. We took note of that feedback and ensured that the document was adjusted. We had significant, we did our own research, we did our consultations with JIS to make sure that the contents of the document would be improved, the strategies refined, and we now have a final plan, which will be implemented from August 1. And I'll just summarize. The main strategies include a jingle, 30 seconds, something that can resonate with the masses. And it, of course, will be aired on 8 radio stations, including television. We will also have a 30-second public service announcement, also aired on the radio stations. There will be videos, significant content to educate Jamaicans on various aspects. of the program, focusing on phase 1, on TVJ and CBN, both. We'll also have a podcast, YouTube, for example, where content will be uploaded, and of course, that will serve to further educate the masses. GIS will in-house now implement its own program. For example, Get the Facts, which is aired on television. So it's an interview feature, and they will interview, say, the chairman or the co-chair, for example, to speak about certain critical aspects of the program. Think tank sessions. Normally when we have think tank sessions, the observer, for example, the gleaner would have a series of articles based on the content that they would have captured. There's also a program called Wink on GIS, which is aired on the radio. We'll also utilize that one. And Student 58A session, we had one for the Bail Act, Minister Nana, some months ago. And so we will also utilize that program. We will have a significant presence on social media for obvious reasons. Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, WhatsApp. Videos will be sent via those platforms to ensure that we capture the masses. We get to, because not everybody will be able to see the ads on TV and so forth. So yes, we will, in the first phase, implement a 6-month program, starting in August and ending in February. Then we move to the next phase. And I'm happy to report that we have adequate funding in place to implement the program at this time. Thank you.
Can I add to that as well?
Before you talk about the steps, I wanted to talk directly to what you were saying, Dr. Spence, about your knowledge of like the way, even of 2 degrees and so on and so forth. For me, it is important to point out that the education that we're giving our citizens is to say get our information about how life is run outside of our country and then come and try to implement it in our country. But we're not teaching our people about how things are run in our country. Right? And so it is critical for me. This is the reason I'm on with the Advocates Network. It's critical for me as a layperson to understand the workings and the rights of every citizen, including myself. And that is why it is so fundamental for me that the constitutional reform is not just about removing someone from our head of government, but actually giving the highest law of the land, giving citizens access to the highest law of the land so that they know what is their right. And that we are educating our youth about the importance of that information, growing with that information so that they can become participatory in how to defend and represent that. So that I think is very crucial in what we're doing here.
Yeah, and there's one thing that has been clear for us here, and I think Dr. McCarthy mentioned it, this idea that when we started to engage the idea of how we engage the public on this matter, coming to terms with the fact that there is so much that is not known about or institutional arrangements or constitutional arrangements, the gamut of it. That one of the things we recognize, and I remember we had a discussion about having to engage the Ministry of Education as well to say, civics is not an if, it's a must. Because if we had been up to now engaged in that process of talking to people about our institutions or history, etc., we would not be at the place that we are now. People would know some more. And it's not because people don't want to know, we don't know that yet, because we haven't really given them sufficient information. That's one. But I also wanted to say on the matter of the Public Engagement Committee, because I was mentioned in this room as chair, and I know there's this narrative out there that says we didn't want to engage. One of the first set of people we engaged, I remember reaching out to Professor Hamilton from way early to say we would like for you to come to the committee way before the conversation started in the press, that we were not interested in hearing from people. I reached out to all the civil society, and I know most of the people in civil society in Jamaica, Professor Monroe, Jeanette. I reached out to everyone to say we're inviting you to the committee, and then passed on the information for people to be invited. That was from like the second week of our sitting. And one of the first set of people we had in this room, about 2-3 months, were the members of the press from all of the organizations. And we came here for our breakfast meeting in the morning to talk about all that we expect the thing to be, and all what you know, just generally just have an honest conversation about what this process is and so on. And that I think one of the things that a lot of people don't recognize is that a lot of people are not really interested in the conversation. I've had conversations with all the unions, because I had a set of people that we work with. I said, okay, let's target this set of people over this set of time. And every Friday we're going to have a webinar with the unions, and I called all the union leaders, and then we said, let's meet with the Jamaica Confederation of Trade Unions first. I called the police, I called the teachers, I called the Nurses Association. Okay, set up dates for us. We're ready. We want to talk to you. You, the leadership first, and then your general membership first. Till today, not one set of those people have reached back to me. People don't even answer me anymore. The Doctors Association, every union group there is to say, we want to have conversations with you. We started, or you would have seen that we started the debate competitions, and we were starting with universities. Didn't work out, but we hope to go back to it when universities reconvene. And we have several different parishes in Montego Bay, for example. Mobe, Cozie, and Sam Sharp said, we want to have our own competition in Montego Bay. And I said, yes, we will facilitate that. As long as you're able to help us to arrange who the debaters are and so on, we will come and facilitate that. I've reached out in terms of reaching out to people from our strata, for example. I've been reaching out to citizens group to say, not a big thing, can we come in? One group said to me, how much money do you have? So some people really want money, right? They want food, and they want transportation, and they want a venue. They figure that they want to come out of the community to have those conversations. So we are still doing it, still trying to reach out to people from our strata and different groups of people. But what I have found, based on and I'm reaching out to different groups of people who I know, to say it doesn't have to be a big, dramatic thing. If you have 10 people in the room and you want us to come, or you want me to come, or you want us to do it, whether hybrid, or you want it on Zoom, or you want us to come, just tell us and let us, we will come and do it. But that is taking a lot more effort than I had envisaged in terms of people being willing to be a part of the conversation.
One of the things I wanted to say about that is that you have to remember, we have 40 years almost of not being included in the conversation. And so for the conversation now to be opened up to the public don't know what to do with it most of all, and said, we are doing that anyway, we'll do whatever we want to do anyway. So it is a change in mindset that we're working on starting now. And that change in mindset has to go from every level, from our primary school, basic school, all the way up. We have to get a mindset of participatory citizenry, because otherwise we'll go back to what we've been taught since colonialism came in, which says, I'll make all the rules, you do the work.
Right, but I want you to understand that that's a long-term work. That's not something that, and it's also, a lot of it is outside of our scope. Because I see you, Commissioner, but one of the things that I have recognized is that, you have to, this matter of civics, this matter of community groups, this matter of MPs, and I have said to both general secretaries of the political parties, okay, organize yourselves. We want to have these conversations at the constituency level. I think to this date, MP Hilton in this room gave me the name of his community development leader. I reached out to him and I said to him, could you organize, we want to come in? Because he said he's prepared to have the conversation. And whenever I meet up on an MP from either side, I'm having this conversation. Because at that level of the grassroots, do you want to have the conversation? Because the conversation has been happening at a certain level for a long time. You know, so, and we, you know, the emails have been opened up. There's not an overwhelming amount of people sending in proposals and wanting to come. We've had to be reaching out to people and saying, would you come? And doing it several times. Can you come? You know, so there is no hesitance to engage. And I think that I have, and continue to, I won't stop. Just 2 weeks ago, last week, we were having conversations with the university about doing some regional conversations by UTV. Just today, I was talking to former dean about, you know, making a space at law faculty so we can discuss some things, because we decided that we wanted to talk about some very specific topics, like the president, the Caribbean Court of Justice. Lalita and I were talking about this. So we want to just have talks, panel discussions on those issues, not necessarily for Kingston alone, but also televised for the rest of Jamaica and the diaspora. There's been, and at the same time, we've been talking to a whole heap of people, whether online or face-to-face. If people call, we turn up. If people say, could you come to my church, to my community group, we turn up. So there is no hesitance at all. I think the thing got out of the gate pretty quickly, and you know, it kind of ran away. But there was never any hesitance to engage, and I think we were clear that that needed to happen. And I think when you see the minutes of the meetings, it will be clear that that was always a plan.
Okay. I just want to make a very obvious point that what we're doing is not an event, it's a process. And with all processes, it is a long-term one, at least this one. And you know, Charles alluded to it and Dr. Spence about the, you know, the education from Charles. So the question for me is, while we might be publicizing and doing all kind of engagement around committees, we know that people are going to have to unlearn a lot of things and relearn a new way of being citizens. So what is the plan? What is the mechanism in place for sustainability post a referendum, for example? Because that's the process. The CRC, you just said, Dr. Spence, things are out of your scope. Therefore, I figure that you have a kind of a, can I use that term, shelf life, so to speak, where this work is concerned. Who takes over from you and ensure that there is sustainability? Because we have a way of doing, and you know what I mean, Minister, when I say shelf life, your work, I think you have a kind of set time frame in which to do your part of it. But there has to be something in place to ensure that this work don't fall between the crevices and cracks. Because we know how things can go, because people settle back into some kind of status, you know, after the thing is done. So we have to think along those lines. And you have 2 degrees in politics. But 90% of the books that you read came from North America and Europe. Political, well, but the fact of the matter, many of us who studied politics, that was not my focus, but I did do politics. I have all kinds of theories from all over the place. There is nothing that educated me about even the Westminster system that I was living under. So the question then also is, how do we ensure, when we talk about civics, we're not thinking about civics that they run up with that I use in primary school. But this is way beyond that. So you need different levels of education and awareness in a sustained way, appropriate to age right up to university level. Because if we don't educate people about what this whole business of government, governance, and all of that, you won't end up with public institutions hiring people properly qualified with degrees but lack certain knowledge and ideas about what it means to work for the people of Jamaica. Those are some of the challenges we are now facing. Because I spent a whole lot of time in the public sector. Police not really the public sector, but you know what I mean. You can't get away from the silos. Because the silos happen because this agency over here believes that it is independent of a particular whole. I visited Thailand years ago, and I think that I was on with the brace. And one of the things that they had that I saw that impressed me at the time, I don't know if they continue it, there was a mandate where once a month, I think it was, I don't remember, at least half a day, parliamentarians, senior public sector people, and business people had to come in a room and be educated about what the government was all about, what were the government plans, to get people to have an appreciation and understanding of their role. So rather than it be a conflict of competing entities, you are like, they were getting collaboration. But we know there's things have certain other issues. But that was what they were doing, and I've never forgotten it because it ensured that people were basically on the same page. There was another thing that I saw elsewhere where certain people who worked university, that was another country that I visited. People went there for particular education at the basic level minister. But when you're going to move on to your particular specialty, then obviously you go and do that. But everybody starts out understanding a certain thing because the education system prepared you to participate as citizens, whether in the private or in the public sector. So these are some of the things I think we're going to have to wrap our heads around as it comes to sustainability. Because as I said, this is not an event. This is a process. And I hope you have the resilience to stick to it. Because we won't be there. Watching you.
I hear that. I think one of the things, before no minister perhaps going to respond, one of the things that certainly struck me is that when we said we really recognize that the larger context of this is with the education ministry and the call for us to introduce civics at every level of the education system. I was going to my granddaughter's school, she's in grade 2, to talk to them, to teach them on Friday, because Teachers' Day, and I decided I was going to teach them about the Constitution. And then I looked at how the American system operates with the Constitution. So at every level they teach the children about we the people, different things under we the people. But they have found a sustained way to do it from as early as preschool. So at each grade level they are introduced to another concept of we the people. Whether it's we the people in respect of their national symbols, whatever it is. But it's articulating it at every grade level, and as the child moves up, the child is introduced to another concept of we the people. But it is, the Constitution then becomes a lived document, and they continue to change it and continue to educate their population. And I know we're not the same, and I know that's the popular example.
Looks like we have to continue the conversation over lunch. I'm just mindful of...
But I'm just saying that is where it continues and it becomes sustainable within the Ministry of Education and in our education system.
All right, looks like this really is just a whetting of the appetite.
Minister, you have lunch for me?
I'm going to, whatever we have, we're going to share with everyone. So if it means minimizing the portions, I'm inviting everyone to lunch. All right, and we can continue the conversation.